Like what we're doing here at cubefortwo? Click the like and subscribe button to let us know. Also, cubefortwo is now a TCG Player affiliate. Click the link in the show notes for all your shopping needs to help support the channel. Alright guys, let's get started. What's good, cubers? It's your boy Matt, and I'm back today with another really interesting topic. After last week's video, I got a whole lot of requests that looked like this. I think a video about parasitic cards and archetypes could be incredibly helpful since it's a concept very specific to cube design. I got a lot of requests about parasitism. So that's where we're going today. We're going to take a deep dive and we're going to look at how parasitism affects cube design. So, I've seen the term bandied about a lot, and so I think the first thing we should do is really define what parasitism is. And that is when a card contributes overwhelmingly inside your cube to one strategy. The primary examples that are probably most parasitic are Mill and Storm, because most of the cards in those decks are only wanted by the Mill or Storm decks, and not necessarily by the other decks inside your cube. But before we get to talking about bad parasitism, we should probably talk about whether or not there's such a thing as good parasitism, which I think there is. The best examples of good parasitism inside your cube are cards like Goblin Guide and Wrath of God. After all, aggressive 1-drops aren't really wanted by mid-range or control decks. They're parasitic, they're only wanted by those low-to-the-ground aggro decks. And Wrath of God is a board wipe, and board wipes aren't wanted by low-to-the-ground aggressive decks. They're not wanted by mid-range decks at all, so they're really only featured in control decks, and sometimes maybe combo decks, so they're parasitic in that way. But that said, we don't want to play without these cards because they're how we maintain balance inside of our cubes. The last form of parasitism that could be considered good parasitism, and this is going to vary person to person and depending on your cube, are cards that are build-around cards or cards that attract drafters into an archetype or into a deck. Maybe a card like Divine Visitation. Now, I know that right now that Sir Funchalot is watching this video and going, Matt, that's a 5-mana do-nothing enchantment and it requires other cards to make it good. And I hear that. But there are a lot of Johnny-style players who see Divine Visitation as a build-around, and for them, it pulls them into this deck. I would argue that you could have a handful, literally a handful, just a few, cards like this in your cube to either signal to drafters that the deck is there, or to draw drafters into a deck, like fun build-around-me cards. But that being said, let's talk a little bit more about what archetypes are most parasitic, what we can do to reduce it, and so on. First off, most parasitic archetypes are probably Mill, Dredge is really parasitic, Storm is really popular but really parasitic, so is pretty much any combo deck. Aristocrats are very parasitic, as is Tribal, and Infect is especially parasitic inside of our cubes. And so these are archetypes that we probably want to avoid when we're building our cubes because they require so many pieces that don't work in other decks. Now, I'm not saying you can't play those archetypes. I just did a video last week on Aristocrats because I love that archetype, but you need to be especially careful when you're building around them. Let's talk about the downsides of parasitism inside your cube. The first is that parasitism decreases pack relevance in draft. It kind of puts the draft on rails, and I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. Some decks in your cube will be worse because of density issues. When you play parasitic cards, it means you're playing less generic good stuff cards or cards that are wanted by lots of decks, and as a result, maybe other decks in your cube don't come together because you're too busy feeding the parasitic archetype. And lastly, sometimes parasitism can require knowledge of Magic history, and it punishes new players. And I'm going to show you examples of all of these. Let's get started. First of all, let's talk about decreasing pack relevance. I want you to imagine that it's towards the end of the first round in the draft, and we're on a Grixis control deck, right? We're on Grixis control, we're passing the cards around, our last pack comes, it's got 5 cards in it. Fauna Shaman's not for us, Angel of Invention, Vraska Relic Seeker, Bloodbraid. We don't want any of those cards, but there is a blue card in our pack, and it's Lord of Atlantis, because we support Tribal in this cube. Can you see how Lord of Atlantis is only good in a Merfolk tribal deck? This is why tribal is so impossible to really support in Cube unless you just build the whole cube around it. So we as the Grixis player, we don't want this card. We would much rather have a more generic card. A card that fits a lot of decks. Maybe like Brazen Borrower, right? Now, is that the ideal Grixis card? It's not perfect, but I have played it in a Grixis control deck, and it's not bad. You bounce it, you get that body for later. So by playing good cards rather than archetype-specific parasitic cards, Brazen Borrower could be wanted by a lot of decks. The Blue Tempo deck, other control decks. There's a lot of spaces for it, but there's only one spot for a card like Lord of Atlantis. So you would have to pass this pack, and as a result, the draft becomes less competitive because the Merfolk player can just let Lord of Atlantis wheel around the table. This is why those aforementioned archetypes are so bad in draft. Now, I'm not talking about gameplay, I'm just talking about the draft portion of your Cube Knight. So, if you're not on the mill deck, you're just not interested in Glimpse the Unthinkable. You're not interested in Glistener Elf if you're not on Infect. You're not interested in the Golgari Grave Troll if you're not on Dredge. So, these cards are not wanted by most decks, and so it lets the player who's on the deck just really draft on rails, while everyone else is just passing cards, hoping something relevant will come their way. But let's keep going. Let's talk about the second drawback of Parasitism, and that's that it makes other decks worse. Right? So I'm going to show you some cards that I used to run in my cube. And no haterade, no shots in the comments, alright? I'm going to show you 4 cards I used to run in my cube, alright? I ran Sulfuric Vortex, Shrine of Burning Rage, Fire Blast, and Goblin Bombardment. Now, all of these cards are parasitic. In particular, the first 3 are only viable in the red aggro deck. And I have to give another shout out to my boy Sir Funchalot and the guys on the Cube Brainstorming Discord, because I got into a discussion with them about cards like Vortex and Shrine of Burning Rage. See, the deal with Shrine is you want it to sit on the board and accrue value as you cast red spells, which means it's really only good in a mono red deck. That's where its value is the maximum. And you're hoping to deal your opponent anywhere from 4 to 5 damage off of it. And Vortex is very similar. You're hoping to deal your opponent damage off of it and kind of ratchet down their life total. They suggested cutting all these cards for generic burn, and so that's exactly what I did. I cut all of those cards, and instead I just inserted 4 generic burn spells. Both I and the guys on the Discord openly admit that these burn spells are not as good for the red aggro deck as the cards that we were looking at before. But they're still plenty good. Searing Spearing your opponent to the face for 3 damage is, it's not as good as Shrine of Burning Rage, but it's still very viable inside the red aggro deck. But the difference is a Boros aggro deck would also want Searing Spear. A Mardu aggro deck would also want Searing Spear, but neither of them really want Shrine of Burning Rage. Grixis Control and Jeskai Control decks would want this burn, but they would not want cards like Sulfuric Vortex, Shrine of Burning Rage, Fire Blast, and so on. And so what you do by playing more burn rather than archetype specific cards is you make all the other decks in your draft a little bit better. And I noticed the next draft after I made these cuts along with some other cuts to get some just generic burn and generic cantrips into my cube at a slightly higher density is that I had a lot more Jeskai control decks start showing up in my drafts, or Grixis control decks start showing up in my draft, where they never really did before because there wasn't enough density of playables to make it worth splashing that 3rd color. Also, just like we talked about before in draft, cards like Sulfuric Vortex and Shrine of Burning Rage and Fire Blast, they would just wheel around the table because the burn player could afford to pass them and draft the burn because they know other players aren't taking the Shrine or the Vortex. They're going to pass it back around. So now the draft is more relevant because the burn player is competing for pieces, and the decks are more diverse and better because there's more playables for them. But let's talk about that 3rd reason that Parasitism has a drawback, and that's that sometimes it forces drafters to have knowledge of previous Magic history. Right? Now, we're going to play a little game. I'm going to put 2 cards up on the screen, and I want you to tell me what card goes with them. Okay? So you open your pack, and inside your pack, pack 1, is a Seething Song and a Manamorphose. Alright? What is the missing card in the cube? Alright, what card goes with them? And the answer is pretty obvious because this archetype is very popular. It's a card like Brain Freeze, right? Because those high mana cards let you cast a lot of spells, Manamorphose lets you draw, and so Storm is viable inside this cube. And that's a fairly well-known example. Let's try another fairly well-known example. Let's look at Pestermite and Zealous Conscripts. What's the missing card? Well, a lot of us know the answer to this one, and the answer to this one is obviously Kiki Jiki or Splinter Twin, right? So you have to have knowledge of these decks from Magic history if you're going to draft in this draft environment. Otherwise, you look at a card like Manamorphose or Seething Song and you don't know what to do with them. You see Pestermite and you go, this card is crap, why is it in this cube? And you just pass it. So parasitic archetypes do sometimes require knowledge of Magic history. Let's look at an older example that some of our younger viewers may not know. Illusions of Grandeur. What's the missing card? See, back when I was a kid, there was this deck floating around called Tricks, and it played this card because the other half of this combo is donate, right? You give yourself 20 life, and then you donate the illusions to your opponent, so when it leaves play, they lose 20 life and they die. The deck was called Tricks back in the day. Anyway, the point is that if you weren't playing in the early 2000s, late 90s, you don't know about that deck maybe. There are other combos that I could put up here, and I realize that we don't play illusions or donate in our cube. But the idea that some of these cards require knowledge of Magic history in order for new players to figure out why they're good is another example of how the archetype is parasitic. You have to know 20 years of Magic history to know why Pestermite is good. So not only is Pestermite taking up a slot inside of your cube, and Kiki Jiki is, and all the other pieces of the combo, but now the new drafter doesn't even know that there's a combo in their pack in front of them. Instead, they're just going to pass those things along. I also don't want you to think that I'm telling you to not play these cards ever, that you can't play Storm in your cube, or you can't play Kiki combo in your cube. You certainly can. But as a curator, it's something that you need to be aware of as you're assembling your archetypes and your cube. But now let's talk about ways to kind of play with your parasites, right? Like, okay, Matt, I hear you, but I really want to use these archetypes. What can I do? Let me show you to a good example that Wizards figured out. Wizards had these mill cards in Innistrad: Dream Twist, Mulch, and Curse of the Bloody Tomb. And as we already talked about, mill is a very parasitic archetype, right? Because you're milling your opponent. Mulch makes you mill yourself. Curse of the Bloody Tomb, you enchant your opponent, and they start milling their library out. So mill is a very parasitic archetype. How did Wizards compensate? The answer is they brought back an old mechanic from Odyssey block: Flashback. Now mill is cool, because if you're milling out your opponent, they can still cast things out of their graveyard, so that's a little dangerous. Or you could mill yourself and play cool build-arounds like spider spawning, right? Because now when you're milling yourself, it makes all of your spider spawnings better, and it doesn't even matter if you mill them because you can still flash them back from the graveyard. But Flashback and mill become even better when you include other build-arounds like Burning Vengeance, because now the Burning Vengeance deck is milling itself to cast things out of its yards or start dealing 2 damage and blowing things up, and when you mill the Burning Vengeance player, you're just helping them, right? So that's how Wizards took a parasitic archetype like mill and started designing the other archetypes in their set around it, by making that mechanic, that archetype, more viable and more relevant inside of other decks. In fact, Innistrad is where we see the birth of one of Magic and Commander especially's most played cards, Laboratory Maniac. So now you can mill yourself as an alternate win con. So again, they're just crafting the whole set around this parasitic archetype, and as a result, the archetype is no longer parasitic. So that's something you can do inside your cube, especially when you're in the design phase. You can design your cube to be built around a parasitic archetype like mill, and then it's no longer parasitic. But there are some things you can do inside your cube to try and just reduce parasitism in general. Let's say you're playing an archetype like Storm. Alright, Storm is all about casting spells, drawing cards, and conserving/making mana. So if you're playing a card like Tendrils of Agony, which is incredibly parasitic because it's only good in the Storm deck, then you have to try and make the package around the Storm deck as unparasitic as possible. So you should play cards like Frantic Search, Frantic Search is great inside the Storm deck because it's a free cantrip that raises the Storm count, but it's also playable inside of other decks. Now, it's not the most efficient cantrip because your other decks would prefer their cantrips at 1 or 2 mana, but it is still playable inside those other decks, and that helps, again, reduce how parasitic the Storm archetype is in your cube. So you can try and make the package around your cards less parasitic. And the other option that I strongly recommend is modal cards. Cards with lots of modes on them are less parasitic. Let's take a close look at Supreme Will, for example. Let's say you're playing a card like Sinister Sabotage or Forbid inside your cube, and what they are is they're just 3 mana counter spells, right? Pay 3 mana, counter a spell. But Supreme Will lets you also cantrip through your deck, and as a result it is less parasitic because now you're playing a card that is both a counter spell and a cantrip, which increases your count of both. So modal spells are fantastic. Look at Bone Crusher Giant. Bone Crusher Giant is a 2 mana shock, and while I wasn't thrilled to have it, I would have much rather had a Lightning Bolt. I have played Bone Crusher Giant in many a control deck just so that I can cast the front half of Stomp, and then sometimes I get around to casting the other half of Bone Crusher Giant anyway. So it fits in the aggro deck, and I have played it as burn removal inside of Jeskai or Grixis control decks. So modal cards are really good for helping to reduce parasitism as well because they fit in multiple decks and they add to the density of both halves of their effect inside of your cube. I hope you guys found today's video really helpful. I hope it answers a lot of the questions that I got after last week's video. It's okay to have some parasitic cards inside your cube. What's not okay is for you to not be aware of and not be crafting your cube around them to try and make sure that there are still enough cards or enough density of effects for your other drafters. Parasitism is something that we need to be aware of, but it's also something that we could embrace as well. That's going to do it for today, Cubers. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you've got any more questions about parasitism or other archetypes or cube ideas you'd like me to discuss, leave them in the comments below and we'll take a look at them. Follow me on the Twitter at cubefortwo, and as always, and until next time, shuffle up and keep cubing, my friends.